From the flat, thinly treed ridge, Rand peered westward over the forest before him. With the power in him, life so sweet, vileness oh so vile, he could see individual leaves. But it was not enough. Dashar stamped a hoof, the jagged peaks behind to either side, and all around overtopped the ridge a mile or more. But the ridge stood well above the treetops below, a rolling wooded valley, over a league in length and nearly as wide. All was still down there. As quiet as the void he floated in. Quiet for the moment anyway. Here and there plumes of smoke rose from where 2 or 3 trees in a clump burned like torches. Only the general wet stopped them, turning the valley into a conflagration. Flynn and Shiva were the only Ashmen still with him. All the rest were down in the valley. The pair stood a little way from him at the edge of the trees, holding their horses by the reins and staring at the forest below. Well, Flynn started, as intently as Rand himself. Shiva glanced occasionally, twisting his smile, and twisted his mouth, sometimes muttering to himself in a way that made Flynn shift his feet and eye him sideways. The power filled both men, nearly to overflowing, but for a change, Lews Therin said nothing. The man seemed increasingly to have gone back into hiding over the last few days. In the sky, there was actually sunlight, and the scattered clouds were gray. It was 5 days since Rand had brought his small army to Altara, 5 days since he had seen his first Shan-Chan dead. He had seen quite a few since. Thoughts slid across the surface of the void. He could feel the heron brand into his palm pressing against the dragon scepter through his glove. Silent. There were none of the flying creatures to be seen. 3 of those had died, slashed from the sky by lightning. Before their riders learned to stay clear, Bashir was fascinated by the creatures, quiet. Perhaps it is finished. My Lord Dragon? Alil's voice was calm and cool, but she patted her mare's neck, though the animal did not need enough soothing. She eyed Flynn and Shiva sideways and straightened, unwilling to reveal a shred of unease in front of them. Rand found himself humming and stopped abruptly. That was Lews Therin's habit, looking at a pretty woman not his. Not his. Light. If he started taking on the fellow's mannerisms, and when he was not there at that. Abruptly, hollow thunder boomed up the valley. Fire fountained out of the trees a good 2 miles away or more. Then again, and again, and again. Lightning streaked. Down, into the forest not far from where the tall flames had bloomed. Single slashes, like jagged blue-white lances, a flurry of lightning bolts and fire, and all was still again. No trees had caught fire this time. Some of that had been sight in, some of it. Shouts rose, dim and distant, from another part of the valley, he thought. Too far for even his sight-in-enhanced ears to hear the crash of steel. Despite everything, not all of the fighting was being done by Ashamen and dedicated and soldiers. And Nayella let out a long breath she must have been holding since the exchange with the power began. Men fighting with steel did not disturb her. But she patted her mount's neck. The gelding had only flickered an ear. Rand had noticed that about women. Quite often, when a woman was agitated, she tried to soothe others whether they required soothing or not. A horse would do. Where was Lews Therin? Irritably, he leaned forward to study the forest canopy again. A good many of those trees were evergreens, oak and pine and leatherleaf, and despite the late drought, they made an effective screen, even to his intensified vision. As if idly, he touched the narrow bundle under his stirrup, leather. He could take a hand, and strike blindly. He could ride down into the woods, and be able to see 10 paces at most. Down there, he would be little more effective than one of the soldiers. A gateway opened among the trees a little way along the ridge. Silvery slash widened into a hole that showed different trees and thick winter-brown underbrush. A copper-skinned soldier with a thin mustache on his upper lip and a small pearl in his ear exited afoot and let the gateway vanish. He was shoving a soldame ahead of him with her wrists tied behind her, a handsome woman except for the purple knot on the side of her head. That seemed to go along with her scowl, though as well as it did with her rumpled, leaf-stained dress. She sneered over her shoulder at the soldier, while he pushed her along the ridgetop to Rand, and then she sneered up at Rand. The soldiers stiffened, saluting smartly. Soldiers Arlen N.Eww, my Lord Dragon. He barked, staring straight at Rand's saddle. My Lord Dragon's orders were to bring any woman captured to him. Rand nodded. It was only to give him the appearance of him doing something. Inspecting prisoners to be sure they were what any idiot could see they were. Take her back to the carts, Soldier N.Eww. Then return to the fighting. He almost ground his teeth saying that. Return to the fighting. While Randolph Thor, Dragon Reborn, and King of Ilion sat his horse and watched treetops. N.Eww saluted again before pushing away the woman ahead of him, but he was not slow about it. She kept peering over her shoulder again, yet not at the shoulder this time, at Rand, with wide-eyed, open-mouthed astonishment. For some reason, N.Eww did not pull her to a halt until he reached the spot where he had come out. All that was necessary was to go far enough to avoid injuring the horses. "What are you doing?" Rand demanded as sight filled the man. N.Eww half turned back to him, hesitating briefly. "It seems easier here, if I use a place I've already made a gateway. My Lord Dragon. Saidin feels strange to me here." His prisoner turned to frown at him. After a moment, Rand gestured him to go ahead. Flynn pretended to be interested in his horse's saddle girth. But the balding old man smiled faintly, smugly. Dashiva giggled. Flynn had been the first to mention an odd feel to Saidin in this valley. Of course, Narishma and Hopwell had heard him, and more added his tales of the strangeness around Ebu Dar. Small wonder everyone was claiming to feel something new, something now, though not a one could say what. Saidin just felt peculiar. Like with the taint thick on the male half of the source, what else would it feel? Rand hoped they were not all coming down with his new sickness. The lamb's gateway opened and vanished behind him and his prisoner. Rand let himself really feel Saidin. Life and corruption commingled. Ice to make winter's heart seem warm, and fire to make a forge's flames cold. Death waiting for him to slip, wanting him to slip. It did not feel any different, did it? He scowled at where N.Eww had disappeared. N.Eww and the woman. She was the 4th Suldame taken this afternoon. That made 23 Suldame prisoners with the carts, and 2 Demain, each still in her silvery leash and collar, carried on separate carts. In those collars, they could not walk 3 steps before becoming more violently sick than Rand did seizing the source. He was not sure the sisters, with Matt, would be pleased to receive them after all. The first Demain 3 days before. He had not thought of it as a prisoner. The slender woman with pale yellow hair and big blue eyes, she was a Shan-Chan captive to be freed. He thought, but when he forced the Suldame to remove the woman's collar, her Adame, she screamed for the Suldame to help her and immediately began lashing out with power. She had even offered her neck for the Suldame to replace the thing. 9 defenders and a soldier died before she could be shielded. Gedwin would have killed her on the spot had Rand not stopped it. The defenders nearly as uncomfortable around women who could channel as others were around men who could. The defenders still wanted her dead, but had taken casualties in the fighting these past days. But having men killed by a prisoner seemed to offend them. There had been more casualties than Rand had expected. 31 defenders dead, and 46 companions. More than 200 among the legionmen and the nobles' armsmen. 7 soldiers and a dedicated men Rand had never met before they answered his summons to Ilion. Too many, considering that all except the gravest injury could be healed. If a man could only hang on until there was time. But he was driving the Shan-Chan west, driving them hard. More shouting rose somewhere far off down in the valley. Fire blossomed a good 3 miles to the west, and lightning struck, toppling trees. Trees and stone erupted from the mountainside farther on. Strange fountains marching along the slope. The roaring booms swallowed shouts. The Shan-Chan were retreating. "Get down there," Rand told Flynn and Dashiva. "Both of you. Find Gedwin and tell him I said push. Push!" Dashiva grimaced at the forest below and began awkwardly tugging his horse along the ridge. The man was ungainly with horses, riding or leading. He nearly tripped over his sword. Flynn looked up at Rand worriedly. "You mean to stay here alone, my Lord Dragon?" "I'm hardly alone," Rand said dryly, glancing at Alil and Anelia. They had ridden back to their armsmen almost 200 lances. Lancers waiting just short of where the ridge began to slope down to the east. At their head, this has been 13Zzz 12,019. The N.Ewws!